I'm David Evans. I'm the third generation in this place, and I'm the owner of Red Camp at the current time, which is about 600 acres of the original holding. I'm the son of Evan Evans and Constance Evans, and Evan was the son of John Evans and Eleanor Lucy Evans, and grandson of the original John Evans, who came out from Wales in 1841-42. And I still own, as I've indicated, 600 acres here. And I'm actually the author of a family history which was released in September of last year, and here's a copy of it, From Wales to Whitfield, which is from the 1830s to the 1950s. And it's been very successful, the history. I've sold about 150 odd copies of it, and it's provided a real link for family members and a real talking point, and that's really what it was intended to do, was to be a family joining together of members of the family and talking about our common heritage so that they have a pride in what has gone before, and perhaps an ambition to do further and set out and do well in their lives. And that's what I wanted to achieve, and I think I've achieved that.
Okay.
Right, Dad. Well, what we're looking at here is part of the old Red Camp property, and the smoke in the distance is a valley which we used to call the freezer because it's very, very cold. There are hills on both the east and the west side, and it doesn't get as much sun in the winter time. We move round, then you can see the Hereford cattle in the foreground, they're mine. We move round, and up on the hill you can see just this side of some sheds there, that's my boundary at the present time. We move right round, and you can see the Bald Hill and Patterson's Malligans and the Bald Hill in the background, which we spoke about earlier, and the cattle in the big hay shed. And then we move round, and you'll see here is the remains of what was a men's hut, the chimney part, and that used to be used in the pre-1940s when there were men working here. It was a very big property at that stage, and also when we had shearers here, and we'd have shearers here for 3 or 4 weeks because they were shearing several thousand sheep, and there was a hut there which they used to live in. That's the fireplace, made with handmade bricks, and that's all that remains of the hut. It fell over. The old Red Camp homestead is in the background. There's not much of it left now. It's been well and truly gone over, so there's nothing of any historical value in there. I can assure you of that. Everything has been taken out, and all that remains is a shell of part of the, not the very earliest part fell over about 15 years ago, and I have parts of it down in the wool shed I've salvaged, but the rest of it was probably built in about the 1870s, I would think, and as I indicated, there's only just a shell of it arranged left now. Nothing of any value there. And in my hand is an interesting horse brand. It's J.E. conjoined, and that's the brand that I believe was used on the horses that Ned Kelly found at Jerilderie and said they were bred by John Evans. They're too good for the police, so he brought them back and let them go in the hills in Myrrhee. And that's the actual brand, J.E. conjoined.
Rightio.
Over here is where the very oldest part of the old house was, and that's the stove in the kitchen area. This fell over about 10 or 15 years ago, and I managed to salvage some of the slabs of which it was built, and some of the interior cladding, the pine cladding, and some of the rafters, and they're down in the wool shed in case they're needed, but the rest of it's just disappeared. And over a bit further is a later part which I think was built in the 1870s. That's still largely intact, but this side of it the wall has come out, the other side is a bit better, and there were some of the handmade bricks that we saw in the wool shed are there still, can be salvaged if we wish. Where that tank is there, my parents, when they were first married, had a house built for them, and that was shifted down to the new house at Red Camp. We call it the flat. It's now derelict, but it was a 3-bedroom house, and when we were children we lived in that until I was about 18 years old, 17 and a half years old. Well, that's the old Red Camp homestead there. It's historic in the sense that that's where was known as the Red Sheep Camp. That's why it got called Red Camp. And there was a shepherd's hut here, and I think that was part of the original homestead, which is just there, which has now fallen over. And that was built on to form the old Red Camp homestead. That's the stove out of it, and that's an indication of how old it is.
Come around this way, Dad. Dad?
I'm right here.
Now come around this way. There's something to show.
Now this wall here was part of the back veranda, the original, very oldest part of the Evans homestead, and there was a baker's oven just at the end there which has now disappeared, but there were water pipes and so forth here. This was a concrete back veranda, and we moved to where you can see the stove, which was part of the kitchen and the original part, and some of the timber is still left there. Most of it, when it fell over, the stuff that was I was able to salvage, I salvaged and took down and put in the wool shed. And that steel square place there is actually a Coolgardie safe, where we used to put charcoal up the top, drip water through it, and that helped to keep things cool. That was a Coolgardie safe. There was a windmill just down there on the right hand side of that big tank there, and you can see the pipe sticking up out of the ground there, which had a petrol driven pump on it to provide water for the house and gardens. But it's a very deep well there, and there's still water in it. I've put a concrete top across it so otherwise cattle fall down it and they don't get back up again.
Yep. So you want this slab here, Brad? That's one of the original slabs at the side of the hut.
Yeah.
The side of the house. So this is one of the original side slabs of stringy bark that was of the very oldest house, which dates back to the 1850s. Okay, so this is the very oldest part. You can sort of see how it's been hewn out of a tree and out of a log, and and split on the other side. If you want to come around this side, you can see.
Yeah, we've got a number of those in the wheelchair.
And there's a number of those that have been saved. Yeah, I was kind of surprised you missed it, but it doesn't matter. Whereabouts was the boot room, Dad?
Just in here.
Was that where it was? Just over here? There was a room called the boot room, and in that there was a whole lot of, up in the loft, there was a whole lot of old letters and diaries and stuff like that. And what we have today, much of that material was up there. And when I was a kid, I was small enough to go up and get it and bring it down for Mum and Dad. And Dad's used a lot of that material to write his book.
Yeah, it's formed part of the history, the documentation of the history.
Yeah. Which is good, because the Evanses have always been very loath to throw anything away, as you have seen. Do you want to describe that shed just there?
That shed there is actually with a dairy.
You'll need to say it's you need to stand next to it and beside the camera.
As all farms had 50 and 100 years ago, they had dairy cattle. If you wanted milk, you had to have your own cows. If you wanted butter, you had to have your own butter making. And this was the dairy. The cows would be milked in the dairy over that way by hand, and the cream brought in, or the milk brought in here and separated to form cream and skim milk, and the butter would be churned in here. And this was the original dairy. Now this was made from handmade bricks. The separator was on that stand just there, and on the left hand side there was shelves with a butter churn and so forth. This building originally had a bark roof, which is now disintegrated, but these are handmade bricks similar to the ones I've got down in the wool shed. And well, I've got photographs at home of my grandmother and grandfather, that's John and Ellen and Lucy, sitting in a chair just outside there. There's a photograph of them there. And this was part of the original homestead and part of the facilities that made up that homestead and the very extensive farm business and the people that were employed here and how they were employed and how they were looked after.
Dad, that gate just over there,
Yeah.
I presume that was the sort of the back gate out
Yes,
of
it was. It was put in, I think, about in the 1930s. Prior to that, there was a picket gate, and we've got photographs of it with my grandmother there. Because there is a photograph of me with Eleanor Lucy when I was about 12 months old, just before she died, just in that gateway, and it was an iron gate at that time.
Okay.
So it's been around for about 80 years.
The other question I had for you, over in that, Dad?
Yep.
The other question I had for you, over in that direction, there used to be some millstones. Was that for grinding?
Look, I'm not sure.
Or was that the blacksmith? Was that for smithy?
They were for grinding axes and that sort
Oh,
of thing.
okay then. Yeah, I mean, this must be 30 or 40 years ago. They're gone now.
Well, there used to be a dairy, a milking shed, and also a forge and a blacksmith shop just across there. They've both disappeared now. I've got photographs of them, and I can place them exactly from the photographs.
Well, that would have been very important in those days to be self-sufficient.
Yeah.
So that makes sense.
And over there, that's fallen over now. There was a garage, and we used to have the car. You ready?
Yep.
Well, this along here is a concrete path which was at the back of the original homestead, and the wall was here. What was known as the boys' room was there, and then the boot room, which was basically where all the papers were stored, and which Evan referred to, was just alongside there. And then there was a back veranda and a meat room, and then it led into the kitchen. And over here, about 10 yards away, was the dining room, which is where that timber that I've got down in the wool shed, that cladding, that pine cladding, was used there. There was a fireplace just there. When I was a kid, we used to have a Tasma radio in here, because of course we didn't have television in those days, and I used to listen to the ABC's news broadcasts, particularly on the early stages of the Second World War, and take them in and tell my mother and father about it. And as an 8-year-old I could pronounce the name of Dnepropetrovsk, which was one of the towns in Russia that was being besieged by the Germans. Dnepropetrovsk, as an 8-year-old, try it. Anyway, but that was the dining room part there.
Probably
That was the oldest part of the house, is just through here. Then the other part, which you can see there, pretty derelict now, particularly this side, was probably built about the 1870s, I think. It was built for my grandparents. And one or two of the children that they had were born here at Red Camp, and Eleanor, the very young girl at 2 years and 8 months who died here, and was carried across the gap over behind us there to the cemetery at King Valley, which is straight through the gap there.
Okay, well let's move through the house, and if you could explain what each of the rooms were in those days, that would be great. Because I never lived here. My grandmother always was very concerned about the black snakes that used to live up here. There was one that particularly used to greet her. It was about 6 or 7 feet long and about that fat. It was very well fed.
This section here was the... you like this?
Yep.
This section here was Minnie's room. That's Eleanor Mary Evans, who died in 1932. John and Eleanor Lucy's daughter. There was a little sort of a washroom, and she lived in here, and I've still got the bed down at Red Camp that she had. It's a wrought iron bed, but that was where she was. Here next door was a passageway. This was a passageway, and there was a door here which with a concrete path that led up to the very old place, and the original telephone was just there, in that part there. It was on the wall. It was a standard sort of phone with a box on it and a hanging receiver, etc. And
well, there was actually a number of letters that Gerald and also Minnie must have written to back here when he was in the war, talking about the coming of the telephone that was sitting here. I mean, it was a bit like you know, the television coming or computers becoming available. It was that sort of bigger an effect.
Well, that
Or
was
impact.
a passageway in here. This was another bedroom, generally occupied. Mum, when we were kids, used to have a young girl of 15 or 16 working here to help her look after the kids, and that was the bedroom that was used by those people. And it's the roof is just coming down. That's all. Oh, this is one of the doors here still. I didn't think there were any left. I thought John's wife took those, and she must have missed this one. But the soil that was used...
There's a womble hole there too.
Yeah, no, there would be. The soil that was used on Gerald and Evans' graves, the soil that was used on Gerald and Evans' graves in France came out of that room there.
Gerald and Ken's grave.
Gerald and Ken's graves.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
Yep. But this was actually quite a pretty good home in the certainly about the 1930s. And this was my grandmother and grandfather's sitting room, and their bedroom was next door. When Jim Evans became Dad's partner, he and his wife lived in that for a short period, about 1945. But all of these walls have fallen out now. And that used to be, at the back of the house there was a pantry, and John swears that he found a bottle in there, which I afterwards sold for $4,000. But I don't know if there's any left there. And that was a pantry. It was a cool area of the house. I need to come up and collect all any of these bricks that are in here. Just had it because Molly took all the doors off and let the cattle in.
Yeah.
Just destroyed everything.
Yeah, they were both pests, weren't they?
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. Anyway, that's what happens.
Is this here? Is that the original roof?
Yes.
Yeah.
Bruce, this is interesting here. This roof has got shingles underneath it, and they were put there, and they could actually run the water off. And I'm not sure that the shingles were done first or whether it was put with iron over shingles, but they were very good insulators before we came in for rock wool and that type of thing. But the shingle wood, and you can see it very clearly there on the old veranda. And some of the hewn slabs are down there on the ground. They've fallen out of this side wall because the cattle have got in here and they just built everything to bits.
You can actually see the wattle and daub here, construction of the wall. Yeah. That's quite an interesting thing. We can go into... So where was your bedroom?
It was in this room here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that little room at the back.
Yeah.
You can see the original slabs here, Bruce.
They're still in perfect condition.
Still in good condition. So they've put the pine over the top to make it a little bit more home-like and modern. Less hut. So this was your room.
When I was about 9 or 10 years old, my bed was just there, just right there. John's bed was up at the top.
Mm-hmm.
We had a fireplace there. We never ever had a fire in it, but the bricks have sort of come down now. You can see the old wattle and daub, which was covered by a plaster. Quite interesting construction.
Mm. Was Dougie in here as well, or was he?
No.
Where was he?
He was over in the veranda. I don't think he
Okay.
ever slept in here.
Oh. And where was Ellie?
She was over in the veranda as well, and asleep out on the what's now the flat, where the kitchen part of the flat is now.
Yeah. And so, what was the reason to abandon the old house, and go to
Just simply that they wanted to build a new house because this was getting to be pretty decrepit at that stage.
Yeah.
And look, this is 60 years ago now. And
Yeah.
it was really hard at that stage.
Yeah.
But you can see the shingle roof up there
Yeah.
on the roof.
Yeah. And that's interesting.
Yep.
And they've used some sort of bitumised paper
Yes,
or
I'm not sure that was there when I was a child.
yeah, sort of an early insulation or early covering or whatever.
Yeah. But, we actually went to the Heritage Victoria people in the 1960s when this was still not too bad a condition as to whether it was worth spending money on to preserve it, and they said, look, there are other places like it in Victoria and it's not worth spending a whole lot of money on, so we didn't do so. We just Dad having died, we paid a huge bill for probate, about $20,000, which was probably equivalent to $500,000 in current times, and we were just building the property up. It had been very run down in the few years prior to Dad's death, and we just didn't have the money to do anything anyway. We were battling to get things back in order, get sheep back in the place, do the fences, all sorts of things, and it just didn't make a sufficiently high priority for us to do the necessary preservation, and particularly when it was said to us, look, there are other places like it nearer to Melbourne, and it's not really worthwhile. As it turned out, had we had it in good condition now, it would have been a major tourist attraction, but that's not what we did. And there we are. But hindsight's 20/20 vision, isn't it?
And
Industrious hum of bees. So this is the front veranda here, and again another good look at the wattle and daub, particularly the axed slabs or hewn slabs. You can see where the axe marks are down along here. Okay. So it's very interesting to see the construction.
The flooring in this section was probably Murray pine flooring, tongue and groove. And the flooring in the veranda would have been ordinary hardwood, I think.
Yeah, I think it's pine.
Is it?
Oh, look at that there.
Yeah.
Pine. May well have been replaced. No.
Now this is an old horse-drawn plough, moldboard plough as it's called, not a disc plough. You can see the moldboards which turn the side when it's ploughed. It was used on Red Camp probably in the early part of my life, and it would have been drawn by a team of probably either 4 or 6 horses. And there was a seat on the back which is now missing, but a man would have sat on that to drive the horses, and it would have gone at about 3 or 4 kilometres an hour. Very slow, but it was used for ploughing, and certainly it's the type of thing that was used for all the cropping that went on Red Camp, both wheat crop and also particularly oats, which was generally harvested with a binder, horse-drawn binder, to make sheaves and chaff to feed the horses with. So it was very self-sustaining. You drew your own fuel, and then you harvested it, and then you harvested some additional grain for sale. And this is a horse-drawn moldboard plough. Now these are wagon wheels from old horse-drawn wagons that used to be used on Red Camp, even up until the time when I was quite a young child, and they were used for carting grain or carting sheafed hay into stacks for turning into chaff with a steam-driven chaff cutter, which used to come in every year, and with a steam traction engine doing about 4 kilometres an hour. And then these wheels were part of a wagon. They've now rotted down a fair bit. They had iron tyres on them, wooden spokes, and they'd be generally drawn by 2 horses, and they're capable of carrying about 1 or 2 tonnes of hay or grain or sheaf hay or whatever. Notice the iron tyres here. Those were fitted on. How they were fitted on, the wheels were made, the tyres were made almost to the exact size, and then these rims were heated up to a high heat, put over the wood, and as they contracted they burnt their way into the wood and became very firm. That's how wheels were made, and these were made by a blacksmith. These iron.
So, Dad, how old's this chestnut tree?
Well, my guess is it was probably put in the early 1900s when Dad and Gerald and the various younger members of the family arrived home. I've got old photographs about the early 1900s which show tree guards down along the main track there.
Mm-hmm.
And my guess is that these were put in about the same time. The chestnut tree, and there's an oak tree over behind there.
Yeah. Did you ever collect the chestnuts? Or?
No, we didn't actually. They're pretty prickly down things, and they're not terribly easy to collect and do much with. Yeah. And I've noticed that on the ground here at the moment there's a lot of chestnuts that come down. The cockatoos have been in and got stuck into them. But a very heavy load of chestnuts this year. The tree itself actually fell over several years ago, but it didn't die out, and it sort of sprouted some new wood, and it's quite a healthy chestnut tree now.
Yeah. Well, we I remember when I was a kid, we used to come here and collect chestnuts because some of them were actually quite big. You know, they're about the size of a walnut, or small walnut at one stage, and but the way to do it was you'd sort of find if the chestnut hadn't popped out, you'd pick it up, and then you get your shoes and pop it out like that, so then you could get it. But as you can see, there's virtually nothing in there. Yeah. And the possums used to get up in there too and pull them down as well. But then because usually they were there sort of May. It was starting to get cold. The fires were being lit back home, so we'd put them in underneath the fire, and then they'd pop, and you get this really very nice starchy chestnut paste out of them.
Anyway, that's what it is, and the tree is here, and it's still here 100 years later. Now there you go, and there's a nice oak tree over behind as well. But this is quite a healthy tree now, but you can see if you look behind that it's actually fallen over, but it hasn't died out, but the limbs have gone upwards, which is what they do, seeking the light. Yeah.
Alright, let's go over this way and we'll maybe go towards the tennis court.
Okay.
And have a look at the old house garden.
It's a water trough for the cows there. That water comes from the pump shed down in the water house, pumps up to the tank up there, and articulates back down the line when the pump turns off. But this oak tree has been up here about the same time as the chestnut tree. They tell me oak trees live a very long time, but this one looks a little bit straggly up the top.
Yeah.
Something wrong with it. There
also used to be a fence. You can see the fence post over there. Yeah. That used to be the boundary fence post for the house, and the house yard, and the other fence ran along the southern edge just there as well.
Yeah. There's nothing to do but dig those things.
So we're sort of heading towards the old tennis court. Dad's father apparently was a very good tennis player, and was in the first 8 for tennis for the school. And obviously it was a good recreational thing to do within the family, and also for family visitors as well. Remembering that they didn't have television back then, and radio was still a relatively newfangled device.
This area of land is flattened out. There's a wombat hole there now which has knocked it out. But when I was a kid we used to play tennis in this area. Here we had the net in the centre. There was a loquat tree there. There was quite a good play tennis court.
And where these trees are just here, that used to be the sort of the garden or of the house, and that's all been grown over. Well, it's grown over now, and it's not in very good condition. Bad weeds, very bad weeds.
The net for the tennis court was about here, and it was back there, and it had a high netting fence around about 8 feet high, so the balls didn't go in all directions. There was a lot of fun. Do you want to go to the garage? Yeah, let's get to that. I think you might go the other way, you don't have to bend and muck around and go to the hearing aids. Tree here.
There's a funny smell, the old house.
Yeah. There's a handmade bricks there.
Yeah.
Now this was the garage when the family car was kept when they first got a car in the 1930s, but it was in that position and it toppled sideways, so the bottom wall, the western wall, is underneath the garage roof itself. But it just fell over.
And that's come off an old car.
Yeah.
So it had a cement floor too.
Yep, that's been a cement floor. That was under the garage. It was actually here and it toppled sideways. But I don't think there's anything inside.
I remember riding, bringing a couple of horses. I think we had one called Sheba. I brought it up here.
Yep.
And I think it started raining, so I brought the horse inside the garage because there's nothing in there at the time.
Yeah, there was a horse-drawn binder there.
That's right, yeah.
And it was dragged out so we could put hay and then it just rotted down.
Yeah.
If we'd had it now it would have been worth a lot of money, except that this would have collapsed on top of it and erected. Anyway, that's not what we did.
Alright, well that's it folks.
That's all there is, there ain't no more. But, I remember when my sister Ellie was born, we used to, as kids, go into Mum and Dad's bed, and I went in one morning and I was told Mum wasn't there, and I wondered where she was, and I was told I had a sister. I wasn't too sure about this business, this sister business. I wasn't sure. I thought it was some sort of threatening species. And when she came home, I was told that she was coming home with Mum. There was a dog kennel just across there near the garage, and I went and hid behind the dog kennel to see what came in. And my little sister Ellie, at the age of about 6 or 7 days or 8 days, was carried into the house, and I was sort of peering around. I can still remember the scene, and I was 4 years old. And this sister thing really did worry me. I wasn't sure what it was. Very suspicious.
She turned all right. She turned out all right though.
Oh yes, she did. She's okay.
She's all right.
I've never
for a girl.
action.
Okay, Dad, could you tell me a little about the establishment of the wool shed, when, who did it?
The shed itself, and this is the remains of it here, it fell over about 20 years ago, I guess, but it was built pre-1880. In fact, I've got a valuer's report, which is in the family history, indicating that the shed was already there. I think it was a bark roof originally. I've got a photograph about 1900 with a half bark roof on it, and it was about a 10-stand shearing shed. And of course in those days it would be all blade shearing. Then there was some machines were put in probably about 1920, and an old Lister petrol engine was used to drive them. But the main board was just across there with the shearing on it. The catching pens were behind, and eventually in about 1968 we built the new shed which is behind us there, which is a much more modern one, and we shifted out of the old shed which was then used for keeping sheep dry in wet weather. But the wool press which is behind us over here, it's a Kurt Selector number 2. It looks pretty drastically reduced in efficiency at the moment, but I would be the last person who pressed a bale of wool in that press. I used to do nearly all the pressing for about 15 years and doing up to 100 bales a year in it. And,
so how many bales would you do in a day with that press?
I'd do probably 10 or 12 bales
10 or 12?
in a day. Yeah, around about 10 or 12. But the shearers were great. They used to come along and get me to put it down without stopping. When they're having afternoon or morning tea, it was a bit of a sort of feature of the whole thing, see whether I could do it or not, and I could. And as I've said, I used to do, I've probably pressed 1,000 bales in that wool press over the years. And it was pretty hard work.
And the shed behind us here?
That was used as a wool room, and when we'd finished the pressing, the wool bales were rolled up here and onto that shed, and then they were put into a truck and sent to Albury. And in fact, the head of the old wool press is just here. It used to be put on top of the bale of wool and pulled down with a lever action. And this here is part of an old shearing shed that would have been part of an old Wolseley plant that was in the shed before I was born, basically, but that was carrying the overhead gear for the original machine shearing in the wool shed. And there's a few old bottles and a few other odds and ends here that have been spread around, and there's even an old separator out of a dairy in there against the door. So there's lots of bits and pieces here.
And these bottles, where did they come from? Are they
Uncle
some
John brought
Uncle
those
John?
in, John Evans, yes. I don't know what they're for. I don't think there's any great value in them, but they are old bottles. And, what's that? It hasn't got anything on it, so it's
Looks like a sauce bottle or something like that.
Yeah, probably vinegar or something of that nature. This one's been a wine bottle. And this one here's got the bottom indented like that on, but it's not no name on it, so I just don't
Probably a
know
wine bottle too. It looks like a wine bottle.
Yeah, it might have been sauce, something like that.
Yeah, there's a.
This is one of the old rafters out of the roof. They were cut by ships carpenters out in the bush. They had Roman numerals carved into them, 20, 21, 22, just to indicate where they were, and they were held together with a peg up the top and a peg down the bottom. That was the construction of the shed.
Okay. Alright, what's that, Dad?
Well, this is a gate hinge, and it fitted into the top of a wooden gate and then fitted down over the top of the post to sort of so it'd swing round. This is a plough shear off probably a horse-drawn plough, and it fitted on just, and these were the wearing face, and as it dragged through the soil it gradually wore down and had to be replaced.
Those look kind of interesting.
Not sure what that one is.
Something to do with the separator, isn't it?
Yeah. This is another gate hinge here. It's been hand forged by a blacksmith in a blacksmith shop. And over here we've got an old cream separator. I don't know where that came from. I think Uncle John maybe collected that somewhere. But that was a hand-driven separator or hand-wound separator for separating milk into cream.
Any idea what that was used for?
No, it was that looks like as though it's been a means of turning something, but I'm not sure about that. This is a weight or something that will have had a weight on it at some stage, and it's sort of been used as a balancing net.
Well, this looks like a bit of a balancing beam here, maybe.
Yeah, look, I'm not sure about that one. Some of these are very, very... this is another gate hinge off a gate somewhere, and it's another part of it there, but it just fitted on. So And this is a piece of chain that's been no, that's actually manufactured, it's not a blacksmith. This is the original Red Camp brand which was put on sheep. It's a triangle, and you can see that's it. And when we had sheep stolen in 1958, that was the brand that was on the sheep, and it was the chap that stole the sheep put another brand over the top of it. But that's the original. I didn't know where that was. I found it, so that's the original Red Camp brand. I'll take it home with me. Yeah, with the triangle brand.
Oh, okay.
And we used to brand sheep many years ago, and using a tar brand. And of course the tar brand was not very good amongst good wool, so it had to be pulled out and treated separately to the main fleece. But that's what it was for. Triangle, and you can still see the blue colour from the branding fluid we're using. We used to have a black tar one, and we moved to a blue triangle. Oh. Yeah, so that's a bit.
That's probably about it, I reckon, Bruce.
So.
Dad, so what area was this over here?
That was just the bottom end, the pens for putting sheep in so that you keep them dry. And then I had a foot rut bath there. I used to pair sheep's feet, and that was a concrete bath with, and I'd fit about 20 at a time standing in a formalin bath after I'd paired their feet as a means of trying to treat the foot rot using formalin. You can see the old beams that were cut out in the bush when the shed was originally cut out and squared off with a broad axe and brought in here and erected. In other words, it was using a construction where the thing was all brought together and then erected here, and that was done by ship's carpenters. The shed itself, when it fell over, fell in this direction towards us, and actually where Evan's standing now is about, or just a little bit in that way, was actually the edge of the shed. And in the original photographs you'll see letting go pens here, so obviously when there was blade shearing there were shearers on the other side and on this side, and it was about an 8 or 10 stand shearing shed. But
this skate here is quite interesting too.
Yeah, that's right. That's one with the hinge fitted over the top of that there.
So the iron hinge we were looking at
that we saw earlier
in the wool store.
Across there.
And here's a more modern one, hinge just there that's been put in later on.
But just look at those beams. They were squared out in the bush with a broad axe, a sort of axe that was used. Instead, they didn't have chainsaws and that sort of thing in those days, so that's how they did it. And it was done with ship's carpenters.
The other thing that's quite interesting, if you have a look here, there's gapped boards.
Yeah, grating for sheep, because then when the sheep were in there, the sheep manure just fell through the grating.
Yeah, and then could be raked out.
But the boards were close enough together that the sheep's feet couldn't go through them.
Yeah.
So just ordinary grating. We'll have a look at some more of that in the main shed, the existing shed.
Okay, and so as we move to this part of the shed, Dad, this was what the pens for the shearing
to
shed.
Hold sheep in, and you could hold sheep in this part here as well. But the actual shed itself finished at the end of those beams across there. And you can see the remains of a water trough there. That was just on the edge of the shed. So the shed fell back towards us. I'll see if I can find one of those Roman numerals. I just can't see any here at the moment. It'll be cut into those there. It's just a pity the whole thing fell over about 20 years ago.
The ones that you saved, is there any Roman numerals?
Yes, I've got some in the shed.
Okay. Yeah, so the shearers would have been over in this, long across this here. But how many stands? 5? 4 stands. Okay. I can remember coming in here when I was a 5 or 6 year old kid to see the shearers and watch Dad at work. Also using the press. I'm sure I was a really big help back then.
But the edge of the shed used to come to here, and that water trough was just at the edge of the shed. And when it fell over in this direction. Mainly because the timber posts that are into the ground just rotted off. It gets quite wet here at times. There's a bit of a soak, and the stringy bark shed poles just rotted off at the base, and the thing fell over. It just didn't have enough stability to stay upright. But there were very few nails used, and it was all pegs and that sort of thing. And there are nails here when it was converted to an iron roof, but it was originally a stringy bark roof. and that shows up in the old photographs. But I know it's an interesting construction.
You can see on that post there, the peg at the top for the rafter, and then as you go down where the rails
have been indented in. Yep. So very intricate prefabricated construction in 1875.
And that was John Evans who...
John Evans would have done that, yes.
Okay, we better go and see the sheep dip.
Yep.
Most important part of any sheep establishment.
Over here, by the way, there's a race there. I used to be able to fit about 60 sheep at a time in it, and I'd get them in there and I'd give them a medication or a drenched, oral drench, and I used to be able to do 700 to 800 sheep an hour in that with one dog to help me, and give them a drench, each one down their throat.
Or a small child.
Or a small child if they gave any cheek. Yeah, but there were sheep yards here for drafting, and the rest of it, they've just fallen over and rotted in because the cattle got in amongst them.
What did you used to say about sheep? You liked them because they were profitable, and you hated them because they had a huge amount of work that you had to do with them. Is that right?
A friend of mine once said sheep are either shitting, limping or dying, and I said they're doing it all three at once. These are just a few posts of the remains of the yards that were here.
Probably a metho bottle, that one. Not to be taken.
Oh, shit. Now this is the old sheep dip, and we used to bring sheep in here, and there was a plunge dip, and there was it was full of water, and it had, in the old days they used to use an arsenic-based sheep dip, and that was used to control lice and keds, as they were called, little insects in the wool, which would cause damage to the wool. And the only way to deal with it in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and probably earlier than that, was by putting them through a plunge dip and wetting them. You do that once every year, usually about 6 weeks after they were shorn. And the sheep didn't like being put through there either. They're not very good swimmers, but it was a lot of good fun, and you'd use a thing to push their heads under the water to make sure they're completely covered. In more recent times we were using chemicals other than arsenic, but we used a lot of arsenic here in past years.
A lot of formalin too for the foot rot.
Not for foot rot.
For foot rot, yeah. So the combination of the arsenic and the foot rot, it's pretty amazing, Dad. You've got 82.
Yeah, shouldn't have done. Only the good die young.
Only good die young, yeah.
So that's it. But this sheep dip was put in by an Italian in about 1942. There had been an iron one here prior to that, and this was put in by a chap named Jim D. Antonio from up the road a little bit, and I remember it being put in. And I've dipped a hell of a lot of sheep in it.
So at the back here,
that's got the remains of the letting go pens. The cattle have been in, and cattle are very, very destructive. If they can get in and knock something over, they knock it over, because it's great fun. Not only that, David gets very cross when it happens, and it raises his blood pressure, and that makes it even better fun. That's what cows are, they've got a sense of humour.
Oh, the engine's not here anymore.
No, a bloke wanted it, so I sold it to him. It wasn't any good.
Yeah.
We used to have a small diesel engine just there, and that drove the shearing gear. And we'll have a look in the shed in a second. Have a look at
and what was this?
Well, that was the water tank, the cooling tank.
So this is the radiator, in other words?
The radiator from the machine.
Good old Evans engineering. Pulleys and stuff. And there's the first model that rusted out, and then that one took over. Here, that would hang off the side of a spray rig or a fertiliser rig, and mark in the paddock where you had been with the previous round. These days, obviously, we use GPS. But this is old-fashioned Evans GPS.
This shed was built in the 1960s. It was a prefabricated shed, a Delarue shed from Albury, and a neighbour of ours named Kevin Shanley, who was a very competent builder, assisted in it. The site was levelled off with a bulldozer by a chap named Neil Sands, and this is the loading ramp. When we had wool, it was rolled out and rolled onto a truck off this loading ramp. It's only used now for storage of hay and a few other items. And the shearing gear is still here too, Bruce. Yep. This was originally a 5-stand shearing shed, and I'm using it only now, as you can see, for storage of loosened hay. But I also took a lot of the timber that came out of the very oldest section of the old Red Camp homestead, which dates back to about the 1850s. You can see here split slabs of stringy bark that have been split out into the bush to make a bush homestead out of. And I've salvaged those because they might be of value at some stage. There are some of the rafters from the original homestead here. The rafters of A&O will have Roman numerals carved into them to say where they actually fitted in. And over across there, some piles of bricks. They are handmade bricks that were used in the old Evans homestead, and the brick pit was just down on the creek, not very far away. And there's 1,000 or more of those. And over in the corner is some timber that was cut in the Whitfield cemetery when we took down the cypress pines. There's a lot of old junk in here, but it's a matter of my getting to it and throwing it out. Brother John left a lot of it here actually. But that's the timber from the Whitefield cemetery, cut out of the Lucas sawmill. There's some more books.
Yep. What's this here?
Oh, that's something that's a cyclone that is used in seed cleaning at some stage.
Yeah, and these, what about these?
Those boards there came from the original own homestead. They were lining boards that were put in probably about the 1870s, and they're they're sawn pine timber. But I just brought them down here as examples of what was being used. This is the wall press that followed the Curtis selector. And,
how many bales could you do in that one, Dad?
oh, not as many. It wasn't as good to use.
Oh, wasn't it? Oh, okay. Yeah. This sorting table for the wall classing table, how old's that?
Well, it was at least 60 or 70 years old. I remember it coming from the old shed. I don't know when it was made, but I suspect in the late 30s, early 40s.
Yeah, because I remember it in the old shed as well. So I suppose with all the lanolin, it would preserve the wood quite well.
Yeah. No, I think the only way we can get in here is to...
Oh, round there?
No, you can't get round because of another table.
Well, we can pull this out, can't we?
Probably. We'll ship all this junk
or we can just go for a dog climb over. Go through there, we should have to get through this.
Well, this is the overhead drive for the shearing gear, and there used to be down tubes came down here hooked onto a handpiece, and they drove it. This used to have an engine driving it round like that, and then your gear would work like that, and that doesn't connect, and then you drag it like that, and the thing spins around, and you had your down tubes there, and your shearing handpiece underneath. The shearer would pick up a sheep in the pen there, bring it out, do your shearing, and drop it down that chute there. And there were 5 pens of that nature, and we have had 5 shearers here on occasion. And you can see there, if you look in, you can see the, this one here is probably better. You can see the grating showing through quite clearly, where the sheep could walk on that grating and the sheep manure would fall through and fall underneath the shed so that it doesn't foul the sheep or anything else. And the wool is kept clear. This is quite a modern shed. It's the best shed in the district, but we haven't got any sheep because nobody uses it as a shearing shed anymore. It could be brought back up to shearing capacity, probably with about a week's work, I would think, and it would then be a very, very good shearing shed. But if you had new gear in here now, you'd have electric gear, and you'd replace this old overhead gear, which goes back to the 1940s. But that was shifted in from the old shed, which has fallen over just next door. We used to store sheep in the old shed to keep them dry, because shearers don't like wet sheep.
And under the shed?
And no, the sheep under the shed would be ones that were let go.
Yeah,
we
but
didn't.
under this part you used to have.
Oh, you could, but we didn't really have it set up to do that. But that's how it worked. And then the sheep would pulled and come out through these swinging doors, and we had 5 different shearers. The engine which drove the shearing gear was down underneath the shed.
Dave?
And the belt came up there and drove those pins. These are grinding discs, and you could sharpen your shearing gear on these grinding discs. They'd spin round at very high speed. It had emery paper on it, and you sharpened your shears. I don't think John sold all of that stuff, but that's what that was. So it was a very, very, very good shearing shed. Very, very efficient. Oh, I'm sorry, here are the down tubes here. Those fitted in like that into the shearing gear, came down here, and the shearing hand pieces fitted onto this end here, and as it spun round up the top, it drove the shearing gear. I didn't realise they were still there. And here is the old red cap brand that went on bales of wool.
This is for oats.
What's that? Oh, that's seed oats. And this is the old red cap brand that was used across each of the wool bales, and that brand would have branded literally thousands of bales of wool with the red cap head brand on it, be sent up to Albury for auction. I didn't realise these were sold here. I thought John had sold them.
There's 2 over here too. Another 2
yeah,
there.
There's a couple there in position. But that's how it used to operate. This is how the shearing gear used to turn over with the motor, and it would drive the down tubes that went through here, which there's a couple of them over there, and on the end of the down tubes would be the shearing gear, a bit like a hairdresser's clippers that they use with electric clippers in a normal barber. It's the same thing, and it was used for shearing sheep. And a shearer here would normally shear at least 100 sheep per day, each man, and that's how it used to go. And there used to be 2 hours shifts, 7:30 to 9:30, 10 till 12, 1 till 2, 1 till 3, and 3:30 till 5:30. And so that was a full 8 hours day, and you'd expect a man who was any good at all to shear over 100 sheep in a day.
Okay.
This is a very old buggy, and it belongs to a chap that used to work with me, died a couple of years ago, named Neville Wright. He was a farrier actually, and a corrective horseshoe farrier, and one of the best in the world. On 3 different occasions he was invited back by the Farriers Association of America for their annual conference to give a lecture on corrective farriery work on horses, and they paid his expenses. He was that good. The Yanks asked him to come and tell him how to do it. Neville Wright, that was his. That's a handmade brick which was made just down on the creek, and it's formed part of the old house building. And if you wanted to, it could be cleaned up and used as a, I guess, as a historic document, historic building.
And you've got historical John's junk on there too.
There's the thumb mark there. That just comes on a handmade brick.
Oh, maybe we'll go up to the old house.
Okay. Well, my name is David Evans, and we're standing in the Whitfield Cemetery, which was set up in 1894 following the gift of land by my grandfather John Evans. The Evans family came out from Clongardock in central Wales, leaving England on the ship Thetis in 1841 and arriving in Melbourne in 1842. And great-grandfather John Evans and his wife Eleanor and two young sons, David and Evans, then moved up to central Victoria and lived there for a couple of years. My grandfather John Evans was born there in 1843. The family moved up into northeastern Victoria and took over the Whitefield run of 60,000 acres in the King Valley in October 1853. The area of land was about 60,000 acres, and they paid £1 a year as the licence fee for occupation of the land. The cemetery was given by my grandfather in 1894, and his father, John Evans, was the first burial here. John Evans died as a result of a shooting accident in January 1862, and his grave is the earliest grave here, followed by two other of his grandchildren, Edward and Eleanor, both infant burials at that time. The cemetery now is a public cemetery, as I indicated. It was set up in 1894, and the original cemetery trust was on the 3rd of September 1894, and it consisted of six families from the district, three of whom are still represented on the cemetery trust. The area of land is just immediately surrounding us, and the old Whitefield homestead where my great-grandfather originally settled is still in existence, and it's just across the road from the cemetery itself. It's interesting because it's at that site that the bushranger Dan Morgan on the 7th of April 1865 held up the Evans family homestead. He was looking for great Uncle Evan to get even with him and Edmund Bond, who'd wounded Morgan when they tried to arrest him for a horse stealing episode several years earlier. And Morgan was a pretty nasty sort of a character. Getting even in his case usually meant putting a bullet into someone. He took grandfather John Evans, hostage at gunpoint, going through the house looking for Evan Evans, who was fortunately in Waggarat at that time, having attended a church fair, and he decided that it was such a good time he stayed overnight, so he was pretty lucky, wasn't he? But that's a general pattern. But the cemetery itself, the Evans section, was set aside by my grandfather at the time of the deed of gift, and I have a document indicating that the land should be held aside in 1886, that being an instruction to David Elder, who was a real estate agent at that time. And as a result of that gift, an area of land was set aside on the eastern side of the cemetery along the main road for the Evans family, and there are some 40 graves here at the present time, including not only, as I indicated earlier, the original John Evans from Clongardock, but also my grandfather and grandmother, John and Eleanor Lucy Evans, and many other members of my family, including my parents, my brother and my twin granddaughters. So it's a very, very special place from the Evans family point of view, and there are some 40 odd graves here, and including memorials for people who are buried in places like Albury, Perth and in Belgium. And a number of the graves actually contain ashes.
Okay, cut. That's good.
Action.
I'm Evan Evans, and I'm David's oldest son. I'm going to help David navigate his way through the cemetery to indicate and to discuss the most important graves. I'll flip to David now, and I think the best place to start is in the beginning, and that is with John Evans, who came out from Wales. Dad?
Well, this is the grave of John Evans, who came out from Clongardock in central Wales in 1841, arriving in Melbourne in 1842. He came to the Whitefield run, as I indicated earlier, in 1853, and he died as a result of a shooting accident on the 20th of January 1862, and his is the earliest grave in the cemetery. Then we move on to one of his grandsons, Arthur Edward, the son of David and Mary Evans, who died in 1871 at the age of about 18 months, an infant burial. And finally, and the early ones, John and Eleanor Lucy Evans' daughter, Eleanor, who died at the age of 2 years and 8 months. and she died at Red Camp from diphtheria, and her father carried her body across the hills on a horse for burial here in the cemetery. Then we move on to...
Also, with Eleanor, Eleanor, we have a locket that was produced by John and Eleanor, and it has a plaited centre of her hair, and we can show a picture of that as well.
Then,
so up here to John.
okay. So moving further into the family history, we've got John Evans, who was born in 1843 at Kyneton after his parents arrived out from Wales, and he married Eleanor Lucy Whitty, who came out from County Wexford in Ireland, and they were married at St Francis Church in Latrobe Street in Melbourne. Incidentally, that's the same church that the parents of Ned Kelly were married in 20 years earlier. And this is the grave of John and Eleanor Lucy Evans.
And was he the person who set up the cemetery?
Yeah, okay, we can do that. John, of course, is the person who donated the land for the cemetery in a footnote in 1886. I'm sorry, and I have a note in his handwriting indicating that the land should be set aside for a public cemetery in 1886, and that's the origins of the Whitfield cemetery.
And now I think Dad will go on and we'll have a look at some of the children of Eleanor and John Evans. First we'll start with the oldest surviving member, which was John Edward Evans, and also Ellen Evans, his wife.
This is John Edward, who is John and Eleanor Lucy's oldest son and the second child, the first of course being Eleanor, who died in infancy. Then we move across to... Then we move across to Mark Allen Evans, who is about the fourth son, and his wife Eleanor Blanche, always known as Pearlie. Her name was Brougham, Brougham. They had no children. Mark Allen was quite an interesting character. He actually went to South Africa in the early 1900s, was there shortly after the Boer War, selling horses and sheep. And quite an interesting character, but very laid back, and probably didn't ever recognise his full potential. But these are his graves here, and they had no children.
Okay. Maybe we go to Gerald and Ken, and then we can do Charlie first.
We do have a number of memorials to people who are buried elsewhere, and two here are Charles and Grace Evans. Charles was one of the sons of John and Eleanor Lucy, and they had three children: Jim Evans, John Gardner Evans, and Kathleen Mott. And they are buried in other places, but they're memorialised here, both the Mott family and Charles and Grace. Then we have here. We have Captain Gerald Evans and his brother Ken, who were killed in Belgium in 1917, 3 weeks and 2 days apart. They're buried in cemeteries near Ypres in central Belgium, and both Evan and myself and my daughter Julie have been there, and we sprinkled graves, soil from the original farm at Red Camp on those two boys' graves in the year 2000. In the year 2000. A very special occasion, and we've got photographs of that in the family history. Then we move on to Hubert, or Bertie Evans, who went to Western Australia in about 1910, and his wife
Caroline.
And his wife Caroline
Louisa,
Auntie Carrie. They died in Belgium. They died in Western Australia and they're both buried there, but we've got memorials to them because that's important to have this connection with the family. Bertie was a very wealthy man and owned, was part owner of a company of 6 stations right throughout Western Australia, and in the 1930s and 40s. Then we move across to another son. That's Evan, that's my father, and my mother, and they are also sons. He is the son of John and Eleanor Lucy Evans, and he had 4 children: myself, brother John, who died 18 months ago, daughter Eleanor, my sister, and also brother Doug, who now lives in Moyhu in New South Wales. And these are their 2 graves.
Probably mentioned John.
This one is our brother John Evans, the first of my generation of my family to die. He died 18 months ago at the age of 80. And we move on to another uncle, another son of John and Eleanor Lucy's, Henry Evans. Harry was, as we always knew him, never moved out from Red Camp. He was never married. He was a very solitary and very quiet sort of person, but he left very voluminous diaries behind, which give a good indication of the sort of lifestyle and the activities that took place on Red Camp in the early 1900s, and has been an important source document for the family history. But Harry died in 1944 of a heart attack. Then we move on to 2 graves. That's Albert and the only surviving daughter, that is Minnie, or John and Eleanor Evans, and Eleanor Mary Evans. I'm sorry, there's Julia Mary Evans and Albert Evans, and they died in 1929 and 1932. Both of them were unmarried. Minnie, or Julia Evans, was a very fine lady, but she was, I think, destined to be the person who looked after her parents in their old age. Who looked after her parents in their old age, but she in fact predeceased them, so she wasn't able to do that. She lived, I think, a very sad life, but yet she was a very strong character, and she's quite an important part of the family history. Then we move on.
Yeah, I think to the children of...
This is one of the sons of John Edwin Evans, Clive Evans. Clive had a wonderful war record and was a very fine man. He never ever married, but he was a hop grower at King Valley with his brother Austin.
No.
A hop grower at 15 Mile Creek with his brother Austin, and he had a very, very fine war record and was a very, very well respected man, but he didn't marry. And I think that's a pity, because he was the sort of person who would have been a great family man. Very fine man, Clive.
I think there was a lot of people that you talked to about Clive, and the recurring theme is gentleman, very respectful, and loved children. I think a lot of us who were children who met him really appreciated him. He was a pretty good bloke.
And we can move on. Well, I don't think we need... These 2 graves here were ones which my grandfather John Evans approved of the burials here, although they're connections of grandmother Eleanor Lucy Evans, but not direct members of the Evans family.
Probably Austin next, and then you come to...
This is Austin and Gwen Evans, and they were Austin was the son of John Edwin Evans, and Gwen Barber was his wife, and they've got a number of relations still living in the district.
That's John Gardner.
John Gardner Evans was one of the sons of Charles and Grace Evans. The Gardner comes from his mother's maiden name of Gardner. He was a very successful real estate and livestock agent, and was in fact the head of the livestock service for elders in New South Wales at the time of his death. Patricia's name was Nagel, and Mr. Justice Nagel was her father. And they have a number of children, many of whom are living in places like Sydney and New York, etc.
It's Jim.
This is another son of Charles and Grace Evans, Jim Evans, and his family are very much involved with the keeping of the Whitfield Cemetery, as are the family of John Gardner Evans. They've been very supportive of the work that we've done to preserve the Evans section.
Jim was also in the Second World War, served in the Second World War, and similar to Clive.
Jim Evans was actually a partner of my father Evan Evans for a number of years on Red Camp after the Second World War, for about 5 or 6 years until the time of Dad's death, and I remember him very, very well actually, and so got very fond memories of Jim and of his family. This is a son of John Gardner Evans and Patricia Evans, who died unfortunately when he was only about 41 years old, and he particularly wanted to be buried here, and his sisters are still very much involved in the family history and in the support for the cemetery. So there's a real family connection running all through these, and this is very typical of what it means to people to have this as a very central part of the Evans family tradition. Peter Spencer Dunlop is my brother-in-law. He's married to my sister Ellie, and he died of cancer when he was only 62. He has 2 children, a son, James Dunlop, who was the Australian ski champion and has actually coached the Icelandic and Dutch ski teams for the Olympics, and he currently lives in Copenhagen with an import-export business. His sister Sarah is married to a man named Will Crozier, whose father was a minister in the Kennett government in the 1990s, and they have 2 children also, and they live down near Geelong. But Peter Dunlop died at the age of 62, but Ellie, my sister, is still living in Caulfield in Melbourne.
Oh, that's about it.
So I'm a bit hesitant there, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Give me my names correct. This is the grave of Jean Esther, who was a daughter of John Edwin and Ellen Evans, and she died as a result of a fall from a tree when she was a schoolgirl, aged 9 years old. And about the only known photograph I have of her was in a school photograph at the Myrrhee school which she attended. This grave is of Muriel Winifred Evans, the first wife of James Charles Evans. This is the grave of Muriel Winifred Evans, and she's the first wife of James Charles Evans, and the mother of Tony, Julia O'Brien and Wendy Marsden, and she died of cancer in 1966. Well, beginning with the gates to the Whitefield Cemetery, the old Whitefield run extended across the hills there, and that gap in the hills is where John Evans brought his infant daughter Eleanor across the hills for burial here in the cemetery in 1873. The land extended right up into Whitfield, up the valley for about 10 kilometres up in that direction, and the original homestead was down in the flats over here. And when the land was sold, that original land was sold to William Hyam in 1886. He built a new homestead behind those trees there, but the actual homestead itself is a little bit further down the valley, and it's down there that the affray took place with the bushranger Dan Morgan in 1865, prior to Morgan's own death at Peachaldale Station 2 days later.
Yeah.
I'm looking for Harry Whitty's grave.